At Winston International Airport, the security lines stretched endlessly, filled with weary travelers shuffling forward. Among the crowd, children cried, loudspeakers blared flight announcements, and hurried conversations created an unrelenting hum of activity. Amid this chaos, most passengers avoided Checkpoint 9, a place notorious for its intimidating officer, Frank Milton. Frank, a veteran of 27 years in law enforcement, was known for his brusque demeanor and quick judgments. A tall, broad-shouldered man with salt-and-pepper hair and a furrowed brow, Frank's intimidating presence was not only due to his stature, but also his unrelenting arrogance. His reputation stemmed from his unapologetic treatment of passengers, particularly those who didn't fit his preconceived notions of what he deemed trustworthy. Frank leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. He barely glanced at the passports handed to him, flipping through them as though they were an annoying distraction. Occasionally, he detained a traveler without much explanation, leaving the line behind him to grow longer. His expression was one of perpetual irritation. As the queue inched forward, a tall, elegant man stepped to the counter. Elijah Darden carried himself with quiet authority, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit and holding a sleek leather briefcase. His presence exuded confidence, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, setting him apart from the anxious travelers around him. Without hesitation, he placed his passport on the counter, meeting Frank's cold stare. Frank picked up the passport lazily, but as soon as he saw the embossed emblem of the Central Republic of Andorra, his expression hardened. He let out a short, mocking laugh, glancing up at Elijah with a condescending glare. "This passport isn't worth anything here," Frank sneered. "Just a worthless piece of paper." Elijah's calm demeanor didn't falter. In a measured tone he replied, "This is a valid, internationally recognized document. You have no right to treat me this way." A murmur spread through the crowd as passengers nearby began to take notice of the confrontation. Some frowned, others subtly took out their phones to record. Frank, however, remained unfazed. He shrugged dismissively and sighed loudly, as if inconvenienced by the mere exchange. Then, to everyone's shock, Frank pulled a silver lighter from his pocket. Flicking it open, he held the flame to the corner of the passport. The document caught fire, and within seconds it turned to ash, its remnants scattering across the counter. The air grew thick with tension. Some passengers gasped audibly, while others stared, wide-eyed. Phones recorded the scene as Frank wore a smug, triumphant grin, locking eyes with Elijah. "Go ahead," Frank said mockingly. "Try to file a complaint, if you dare." Elijah remained still for a moment, bending to brush the ashes from the counter. Straightening, he fixed Frank with an unshakable, piercing stare. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable edge of authority. "You'll regret this," he said firmly. Without another word, Elijah turned and walked away, his suit jacket swaying slightly with each confident stride. The silence that followed was almost deafening as the crowd watched him leave, stunned by the officer's brazen act. Frank shrugged and returned to his chair, feigning indifference. What he didn't realize was that this single act would set off a chain of events that would shake his world to its very core. For the man whose passport he had burned wasn't just any traveler. He was Miles Preston, the newly appointed chief of security for the entire airport system. The events at the airport would ignite a chain reaction, one that would not only disrupt Frank Milton's life, but also bring unwanted scrutiny to the entire department he served. After his shift ended, Frank drove home, the image of the man in the tailored suit, with the piercing, unwavering stare replaying in his mind. Despite the unease tugging at the edges of his thoughts, Frank dismissed it with a shrug. He assured himself he'd done nothing wrong, he was simply doing his job. As Frank's car pulled into the driveway of his modest two-story suburban home, the warm glow of light spilled through the windows. The house radiated the comfort of familiarity, but Frank had no idea that the story he was about to recount would disturb the peace inside. His wife, Marlene Milton, was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen. Their daughter, Ava, the university student, sat at the dining table with her laptop open, engrossed in an assignment. Frank strode into the house, exuding self-satisfaction as he dropped onto the living room sofa. "Quite the day at the airport," Frank began, his voice tinged with pride. "Some arrogant guy came through, strutting around like he owned the place, fancy suit, fancy briefcase, waving a passport from some small African country like it was a golden ticket. I taught him a lesson. Marlene turned. Her hands paused mid-chop, a puzzled expression on her face. What do you mean, Frank? What did you do? Frank laughed heartily, his smugness on full display. That passport? Worthless. I burned it, right there in front of everyone. You should have seen his face. Priceless. Marlene froze, her expression darkening as her initial surprise shifted to discomfort. Frank, don't you think that's too much? What gives you the right to burn someone's passport? What if he reports you? Waving her off, Frank replied with an air of indifference. He won't. People like him talk big, but they back down when the law stands in their way. Ava couldn't contain her frustration any longer. She closed her laptop and rose from the table, her voice sharp. Dad, do you even realize what you've done? That wasn't just humiliating for him. It disgraced the entire department. You're supposed to represent the law, not abuse it. Frank turned to his daughter, his eyes narrowing. Ava, you don't understand. This is my job. Some people need to be reminded who's in charge. She stepped closer, her voice rising. By burning his passport? Don't you see how wrong that is? It's discrimination. It's an abuse of power. This is why people don't trust the police. Frank scowled, clearly annoyed by her challenge. Sitting up straight, he shot back. Don't lecture me, Ava. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. Don't let your college professors fill your head with nonsense. Marlene stepped in, hoping to de-escalate the brewing argument. Frank, maybe Ava has a point. Times are different now. Things like this can go viral on social media. You never know who might have been recording. Frank rose abruptly, his irritation clear. You're both being ridiculous. I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job. Don't forget, I've been keeping this family safe for decades. With that, he stormed upstairs, leaving Marlene and Ava exchanging worried glances. Marlene sighed deeply, questioning whether the man she had admired for so long was still the same. Ava returned to her laptop, but her thoughts were clouded with concern. One question lingered in her mind. Was her father simply doing his job, or had he crossed a line that couldn't be ignored? Upstairs, Frank stood by the window, staring at the quiet street below. Outwardly calm, he couldn't shake the sting of his wife and daughter's words. Yet he pushed the doubts aside, telling himself once more that he had done nothing wrong. What Frank didn't know was that his actions at the airport had been caught on camera. The video was already circulating, and what he saw as a moment of personal triumph would soon become his greatest nightmare. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of Frank's car, he drove to the station. The sounds of the lively streets around him barely registered. He was too preoccupied with the lingering tension from the previous night's argument. Turning on the car radio to distract himself, Frank caught a news anchor discussing the growing divide between police departments and the communities they served. With a dismissive shake of his head, he muttered, "They have no idea what it's like to be on the front lines." Upon arriving at the station, Frank immediately noticed something unusual. Officers were huddled in small groups, whispering and stealing glances toward the main meeting room. Their hushed conversations carried an air of anticipation. "What's going on?" Frank asked Officer Bethany Ruiz, a younger officer walking by. "You haven't heard?" she replied, excitement flickering in her tone. "We have a new chief of security. He's giving his first address this morning." Frank smirked, his lips curling into a sardonic smile. Another suit from the top trying to fix what they don't understand. Let me guess, he's going to talk about reforms and accountability. Bethany gave a polite nod, but didn't respond further, moving toward the meeting room with the rest of the crowd. Frank followed reluctantly, his irritation simmering. He had no idea the man he had humiliated the day before was about to walk into his life again, this time as his new boss. Frank Milton leaned back in his chair, a resigned smirk tugging at the corners of his lips as Officer Bethany Ruiz passed by. "We've got a new chief starting this morning," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. Frank scoffed, shaking his head. "Another suit from headquarters sent to clean us up. I bet he's never done a real day's work in his life." Bethany gave him a polite smile and walked away without comment. Frank watched her leave before slouching further in his chair. He grabbed a file off his desk but didn't bother opening it, his gaze drifting around the busy room. Other officers were heading toward the meeting room, eager to hear the new chief's address. After a few moments of hesitation, Frank stood, sighing loudly, and followed them with reluctant steps. The meeting room was already packed by the time Frank arrived. Younger officers squeezed into the back rows, chatting nervously, while the more seasoned veterans sat closer to the exits, ready to make a quick escape if the speech dragged on. Frank took a seat in the back, crossing his arms with his usual air of indifference. The chatter died down as the door opened, and a tall man in a sharp black suit entered. His polished shoes clicked purposefully against the floor, each step radiating authority. The man strode confidently to the podium, his calm, commanding presence silencing the room without him saying a word. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady and warm, yet exuding strength. "I'm Elijah Barnes, your new chief of security." For a moment, the room froze. A few officers exchanged glances, surprised by the man's commanding presence, but most remained silent, waiting for him to continue. At the back of the room, Frank felt his heart stop. His eyes widened as he stared at the man at the podium. The tailored black suit, the tall stature, the unmistakable voice, it was him. The man from the airport, the flames devouring his passport, his piercing glare, and his chilling words, "You'll regret this," came rushing back to Frank's mind. His face flushed, and his heart pounded so loudly that he worried others might hear it. While Frank struggled to collect himself, Elijah Barnes continued, his voice steady and confident. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you," Elijah said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Our mission is to protect and serve the community, but to do so effectively, we need to ensure that fairness and mutual respect are at the core of everything we do." Each word landed heavily on Frank, like a weight pressing on his chest. He could hardly focus, his mind racing with anxiety. Did Elijah remember him? Would the airport incident surface? When Elijah's speech ended, the officers began filing out. Some murmured about their first impressions of the new chief, while others remained silent, returning to their workstations. Frank stayed seated, his eyes locked on Elijah as he stepped down from the podium and began conversing with senior staff. The unease in Frank's chest grew. He tried to convince himself that Elijah might not remember him, that the whole thing could blow over. But deep down, he knew the truth. His unchecked arrogance and authority were finally catching up to him. His chair, once a symbol of his dominance, suddenly felt unsteady beneath him. It was as if a storm was brewing, and he was standing in its direct path. Abruptly, Frank rose and hurried out of the room, avoiding the gaze of his colleagues. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his conversations, exuding calm confidence. At one moment, his gaze flicked briefly toward the back of the room where Frank had been sitting, and a faint smile crossed his lips, a knowing expression, as though everything was unfolding precisely as he had anticipated. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Frank. He struggled to focus on his work, his mind haunted by Elijah's speech and the unsettling calmness of the man who now held the power to upend his life. A few days after assuming his role, Elijah began enacting sweeping changes within the department. In an all-hands meeting, he addressed the entire staff. "We need to build a workplace culture based on transparency and respect," he said firmly. "Not just with the community but among ourselves. To that end, I want you all to know that any misconduct will be addressed decisively." Elijah outlined several new initiatives, including an anonymous reporting system where officers could report unethical behavior without fear of retaliation. He also introduced regular internal audits to ensure accountability and encouraged open discussions about unresolved issues within the department. The room was silent as Elijah spoke, but not everyone welcomed the changes. Seasoned officers, including Frank, exchanged uneasy glances. To them, these reforms felt like unnecessary interference. Frank didn't bother hiding his disdain. Later, in private conversations with trusted colleagues, he scoffed, "As if we need more rules. We've been doing things this way for decades, and it's worked just fine." But not everyone shared his perspective. Younger officers like Bethany Ruiz found hope and inspiration in Elijah's leadership. Bethany, who had always felt overshadowed by the harsh atmosphere created by veterans like Frank, felt encouraged to step forward and share her voice. It was clear that Elijah's arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that Frank Milton wasn't sure he would survive. During an internal audit meeting, Elijah Barnes spoke with a calm but purposeful tone. "Does anyone have anything they'd like to share? I'm here to listen, not to judge." Officer Bethany Ruiz hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, especially Frank Milton, who sat in the corner with his arms crossed, his watchful eyes fixed on her. Bethany knew this was her moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had stayed silent out of fear. She rose to her feet, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadier as she spoke. "I'd like to share something I witnessed," she began. The room fell into complete silence. "I saw Officer Milton abusing his authority during a security check," Bethany continued. "He intimidated a civilian without valid justification, simply because they didn't meet his arbitrary expectations." Frank's eyes widened in disbelief, and his gaze hardened as he glared at Bethany. But she didn't falter, her voice growing more resolute. "I didn't speak up at the time because I feared retaliation," she said, her tone unwavering. "But if we're serious about creating change, it has to start here." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Frank let out a derisive laugh, breaking the silence. "What nonsense are you spouting?" he sneered. "Do you even know who you're accusing?" Elijah raised a hand, silencing Frank immediately. Turning to Bethany, he gave her an encouraging nod. "Thank you, Ruiz. I appreciate your courage in coming forward. That's exactly the kind of transparency we need." Bethany sat down, her heart racing, but the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. After the meeting, Elijah wasted no time. He ordered a comprehensive investigation into Frank Milton's conduct. Reports from the anonymous reporting system began to pile up, and Frank's name appeared repeatedly. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed far more than the incident Bethany had described. A pattern of abuses of power stretching back years came to light. The most damning piece of evidence was a video from the airport, footage showing Frank burning Elijah's passport. Holding the USB drive containing the video, Elijah's expression hardened. It was time to bring the truth to light. In the days that followed, Frank felt the walls closing in around him. The respectful glances he was once used to receiving had turned into scrutinizing stares. He tried to maintain his composure, but the mounting accusations and investigations weighed heavily on him. After work, Frank gathered a few of his remaining allies in the station's smoking area. "This is a witch hunt, nothing more," he grumbled bitterly. "That guy Barnes just wants to humiliate me, to flex his authority, but I won't go down without a fight." His voice was defiant, but deep down, Frank knew he was losing his grip. The department was changing, and for the first time in his career, Frank's position of power felt dangerously unstable. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. As the investigation gained momentum, Elijah Barnes's efforts started yielding tangible results. Frank's name appeared frequently in reports, and officers like Bethany Ruiz, emboldened by Elijah's leadership, began to speak out more openly. But Elijah's reforms didn't come without pushback. Some veteran officers, accustomed to the old ways, grew increasingly dissatisfied. Frank, feeling cornered, decided it was time to act. Late one evening, in the same smoking area, he convened a small group of veteran officers still loyal to him. The group included Greg Warren, an old friend of Frank's, and Lieutenant Simon Hayes, a longtime stalwart of the department. Taking a long drag from his cigarette, Frank's eyes glinted with a cold resolve. "We can't let Barnes keep running things like this. He's tearing down everything we've built." Greg furrowed his brow. "And what's your plan? Barnes doesn't seem like the kind of guy you can take down easily." Frank smirked faintly. "No one's perfect. If Barnes wants to dig into my past, we'll dig into his." Simon, typically the quiet one, asked, "What are you suggesting?" Leaning in, Frank lowered his voice, speaking with calculated intent. "We'll fabricate evidence, make it look like Barnes abused his power during his previous post. A few questionable financial records, some falsified complaints. With a little finesse, we can force him to defend himself instead of targeting us." Over the next several days, the group put their plan into action. Simon, experienced in record management, forged documents implicating Elijah in taking illicit payments at his previous department. Greg used his connections to spread rumors, planting seeds of doubt among their colleagues. Meanwhile, Frank maintained an outwardly cooperative demeanor, biding his time until he could escalate their false evidence through official channels. But Frank underestimated Elijah Barnes. One day, Elijah received an anonymous report alleging financial misconduct in his previous role. Instead of reacting defensively, Elijah immediately ordered an investigation into the claims. With the help of his trusted team, he quickly identified anomalies in the fabricated records. That afternoon, as Frank sat at his desk, Elijah walked into his office, a folder in hand. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy as the tension between the two men became palpable. "Milton, I need a word with you," Elijah said, his tone calm but sharp. Frank looked up, feigning indifference. "What's this about, Chief?" Elijah locked eyes with him, placing the folder on Frank's desk. "I've reviewed this evidence, and I know exactly where it came from." Frank stiffened but masked his unease with a thin smile. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Elijah leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but making each word carry weight. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? You and your team tried to smear me, fabricating documents, spreading lies. It's all here." Frank's palms began to sweat, but he refused to back down. "If you have evidence, Chief, go ahead and present it." Straightening up, Elijah replied with quiet authority. "Oh, I will. And when I do, you'll face the consequences." Frank stared after Elijah as he walked out of the office, a sinking feeling taking root in his chest. For the first time, Frank realized he might be in over his head. When Elijah Barnes received an anonymous report accusing him of financial misconduct in his previous role, he didn't hesitate. With the help of his tech team and trusted staff, he launched an investigation into the origins of the documents. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Clear anomalies in the records pointed directly to Frank Milton and his group. That afternoon, as Frank sat at his desk pretending to focus on paperwork, Elijah entered the office, a folder in hand. The air immediately grew tense. Nearby colleagues subtly paused their work, their ears straining to catch what was about to unfold. "Milton, I need a word with you," Elijah said, his voice calm yet sharp enough to cut through the room's silence. Frank looked up, feigning composure. "What's this about, Chief?" Elijah walked to Frank's desk and placed the folder down firmly. He locked eyes with Frank and said, "I've reviewed this evidence, and I know exactly where it came from." Frank stiffened in his chair but quickly plastered on a thin smile. "I don't know what you're implying." Leaning in slightly, Elijah's tone dropped, each word laced with unshakable authority. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? You and your team tried to smear me, fabricating documents, spreading lies. Let me make this clear. I'm not easily defeated." Sweat began to bead on Frank's back, but he forced himself to hold his ground. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Chief," he said, his voice tight. "If you have evidence, feel free to present it." Elijah straightened, his gaze steady and unwavering. "The evidence will be presented, Milton, and mark my words, you will be held accountable for every single one of your actions." The following day, Elijah convened an emergency meeting with senior officers. The tension in the room was palpable as officers shuffled into their seats, sensing that something big was about to be revealed. Frank sat in the front row, his face rigid and unreadable, though his knuckles were white from gripping the arms of his chair. Standing at the podium, Elijah began. "We have concluded a thorough investigation into the recent allegations. What we've uncovered is deeply troubling." He opened the folder and began to lay out the evidence piece by piece. Forged documents, tampered records, and fabricated complaints, all meticulously debunked. As Elijah spoke, the room grew quieter, the weight of the revelations pressing down on everyone present. Elijah's voice grew firmer. "We cannot tolerate behavior like this. The integrity of this department is not something to be undermined by selfish schemes or petty conspiracies." Frank sat frozen, his face pale, as the disdainful stares of his colleagues bore into him. Those who had once silently supported him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. It was over. Frank knew it. Yet even as his world collapsed around him, a flicker of resentment burned within him. In his mind, this wasn't the end, not yet. Elijah believed he had brought the internal chaos under control, but a new storm was brewing, this time from outside. Early one Monday morning, his phone buzzed incessantly. When he checked the screen, his heart sank. A video from the airport had gone viral. The footage showed Frank Milton burning Elijah's passport, the flames consuming the document as Frank sneered, "Go ahead, try to complain." The video spread like wildfire, sparking outrage. Thousands of comments flooded social media, demanding accountability and condemning Frank's actions. By midday, protests had erupted outside the police station. Activists carried signs that read, "Justice for all" and "No to discrimination." Their chants, demanding Frank's dismissal, echoed relentlessly, reverberating against the station's glass walls. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers unaccustomed to such intense public scrutiny grew uneasy, avoiding the windows where the crowd outside continued to grow. Frank, on the other hand, attempted to project nonchalance. "These are just a bunch of rabble-rousers," he scoffed during an internal meeting. "We don't need to pay them any attention." Elijah, standing at the head of the table, remained composed. After a pause, he fixed his gaze on Frank, his expression cold and firm. "Rabble-rousers, or citizens demanding the transparency and fairness we promised them?" Elijah's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. "You should remember, Milton, that it's your actions that led to this." Frank clenched his fists under the table but stayed silent. That afternoon, tensions escalated. A group of protesters pressed against the security barriers, demanding to speak with Elijah directly. The situation grew volatile when an older protester was shoved to the ground, prompting shouts of anger. Some younger protesters retaliated, pushing back against the officers at the barricades. Reinforcements were called in to maintain order. From his office, Elijah heard the commotion and immediately stepped outside. As he approached the entrance, the chaotic scene came into view. A furious crowd, a tense line of officers, and the growing risk of a physical altercation. "Stop this immediately!" Elijah's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. All eyes turned toward him. Elijah walked directly into the fray, showing no hesitation. He raised his hand, signaling for the officers to stand down. "No one is to use force. This is not how we resolve issues," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping over the security detail. Turning to the crowd, Elijah softened his tone without losing its authority. "I understand your anger," he said. "I understand your demand for justice. I want the same thing. But if we let emotions take over, we achieve nothing. Let me speak with you." The crowd's murmurs quieted, and a middle-aged woman, clearly one of the leaders, stepped forward. "Chief Barnes," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We want to know what you're going to do to make sure officers like Frank Milton can't get away with this kind of abuse ever again." Elijah nodded. "I promise you, there will be a thorough and transparent investigation. Any misconduct, no matter who is responsible, will be addressed decisively. I also promise that we will continue implementing reforms to ensure this department serves everyone fairly. But I need your cooperation. Express your concerns peacefully, and I will listen." A brief silence followed. Then the woman nodded slowly. "We'll give you a chance," she said. "But don't expect us to wait forever." Elijah met her gaze. "You won't have to." That evening, after the crowd had dispersed, Elijah sat in his office, gazing out the window. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. Public trust had been shaken, and words alone wouldn't be enough to restore it. But he also knew that every step he took, no matter how difficult, brought him closer to the kind of justice and fairness the community deserved, and that thought gave him strength. Elijah Barnes stepped into the fray without hesitation, his commanding presence immediately drawing the crowd's attention. Raising his hand, he addressed the officers, his tone firm and unyielding. "No one is to use force," he said, his piercing gaze sweeping over the security detail. "This is not how we resolve issues." Turning to face the crowd, Elijah's tone softened, though it retained its authority. "I understand your anger. I understand your demand for justice. I want that too. But if we let emotions take over, we achieve nothing. Let me speak with you." The murmurs among the protesters gradually subsided. After a moment, a middle-aged woman, likely the group's leader, stepped forward. "Chief Barnes," she began, her voice steady but resolute, "we need to know what you're going to do to make sure that someone like Frank Milton can't abuse their power again." Elijah nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I promise you there will be a thorough and public investigation. Any misconduct, no matter who is responsible, will be addressed decisively. Additionally, I will continue implementing reforms to create a more transparent and accountable department. But I need your cooperation. Express your concerns peacefully, and I will ensure you're heard." A brief silence followed as the woman studied Elijah's face. Slowly, she nodded. "We'll wait to see your actions," she said. "But don't expect us to wait forever." Elijah felt the weight of her words but remained steadfast. "You won't have to. Change is coming." That evening, as the crowd dispersed and the station quieted, Elijah sat in his office, staring out the window. The weight of the day's events hung heavily on him. He knew this was only the beginning. Public trust had been shaken to its core, and words alone wouldn't restore it. Yet Elijah believed that with each step, no matter how daunting, he was moving closer to his goal, a police force that truly served justice and fairness. Meanwhile, Frank Milton sat alone in the smoking area, his eyes bloodshot. He knew the stability of his career was crumbling beneath him, and his position was no longer secure. Yet bitterness smoldered within him, a refusal to accept that decades of power and influence could end this way. Though he didn't voice it, Frank silently vowed to find a way to strike back. The protests and public outrage had ignited a firestorm of criticism that extended beyond the demonstrations. Social media buzzed with demands for transparency, and calls for a thorough investigation into Frank Milton's actions grew louder. Elijah had no choice but to expedite the case, and fortunately, he had the evidence he needed. 3 days after the protests, Elijah convened a full departmental meeting. The room was packed with officers, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Frank sat in the corner, arms crossed, trying to feign indifference, but the strain was evident on his face. Elijah entered the room carrying a laptop and a file, his demeanor calm but commanding. He stepped to the front and surveyed the crowd before speaking. "We faced significant challenges over the past week," Elijah began, his voice steady and authoritative. "Today, I'm here to share the results of our investigation." He placed the laptop on the podium and connected it to the room's large screen. Within seconds, footage from the airport's security cameras appeared. The video clearly showed Frank at the checkpoint, lighting Elijah's passport on fire. The room fell silent. The tension was so thick, it was almost tangible. Officers stared at the screen, some with their mouths agape, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Turning back to the room, Elijah's voice took on a steely edge. "This is what occurred at the airport. This video, along with witness statements and additional evidence, confirms that Officer Frank Milton severely violated protocol and professional ethics. His actions not only tarnished this department's reputation, but also breached international standards of fairness and justice." Frank froze in his seat, his face flushing deep red. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted, attempting to cling to his authority. "You can't convict me based on one video." Elijah remained composed, his sharp gaze fixed on Frank. "I'm not relying on just this video, Milton. I have dozens of reports from your colleagues. If you want to challenge this further, I'm prepared to present everything to the disciplinary board." The meeting concluded, but the tension lingered throughout the station. After the evidence was revealed, officers who had previously stayed silent about Frank's behavior began to speak out. Officer Bethany Ruiz, who had initially exposed Frank, provided additional accounts of his misconduct. Other officers, hesitant at first, soon followed her lead. "He threatened me when I tried to report one of his violations," Officer Brian Lane admitted during a private meeting. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid for my job, but now I think it's time to come forward." Veteran Lieutenant Clara Simmons added her voice. "It wasn't just the airport incident. Frank has been using his authority to intimidate vulnerable individuals for years. It's been happening for far too long, and no one dared to intervene." Each new revelation further isolated Frank. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the growing storm of accusations. Frank, now like a cornered animal, scrambled to defend himself. He approached former colleagues in private, pleading with them to stay loyal. "We've worked together for years," he said, his tone a mix of desperation and defiance. "You're not going to abandon me now, are you?" But the usual response was silence, or avoidance. That evening, Frank sat alone in his living room, staring blankly into space. The respect and authority he had once commanded were gone. His career, His reputation and even his future were slipping through his fingers. Yet rather than acknowledge his mistakes, Frank clung to the belief that he was the victim of a witch hunt. Deep down, however, he knew the truth. His reign of unchecked power had come to an end. Each new revelation about Frank Milton's misconduct further isolated him. Former allies, once willing to turn a blind eye, now distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into the growing storm. Desperate, Frank resorted to pleading with colleagues in private. "We've worked together for years," he said, his tone a mix of desperation and defiance. "You're not going to abandon me now, are you?" But his pleas were met with silence, averted eyes, or dismissive excuses. That evening, Frank sat alone in his dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the wall. The respect of his peers, his position at the station, and his career itself were slipping away. Yet, instead of confronting his actions, Frank clung stubbornly to the belief that he was a victim of a witch hunt. Meanwhile, Elijah Barnes continued to press forward with the investigation. His approach remained transparent and diligent, driven by a commitment to restore trust, not just within the department, but with the community watching his every move. Elijah understood that exposing Frank's wrongdoing was just the beginning. True reform required more than accountability. It demanded systemic change and the rebuilding of fractured relationships. Though Elijah remained focused, he also knew that Frank was not entirely defeated. He braced himself for what might come next. Elijah refrained from celebrating any victories. Alone in his office late at night, the weight of the department's challenges bore down on him. Memories from his past resurfaced, painful yet motivational experiences that had shaped the leader he had become. As the son of immigrant parents, Elijah had grown up in a poor neighborhood where discrimination and violence were part of daily life. His parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, while Elijah, a bright and ambitious teenager, fought constantly for fair treatment. One memory stood out vividly. At 16 years old, Elijah had been walking home from school, wearing a worn hoodie and carrying a backpack full of books, when two police officers stopped him. Without offering any explanation, they demanded to search his bag. "What did you steal, kid?" One of them sneered as they rifled through his belongings roughly, tossing his books to the ground without care. Elijah had tried to remain calm. "It's just my books. I'm coming home from school," he explained. But his words fell on deaf ears. The humiliation of that moment had burned into his memory, leaving an indelible mark. That day, Elijah had made a promise to himself. One day, he would work in law enforcement, not to become like those officers, but to change the system so no child would have to endure the indignity he had faced. Now, sitting in his office and gazing out at the golden light of the setting sun, Elijah felt the weight of that promise more deeply than ever. He wasn't just here to hold Frank accountable. He was here to build something better. Elijah began by reaching out to younger officers in the department, particularly those who had experienced frustration or injustice. He spoke individually with officers like Bethany Ruiz, who had bravely exposed Frank, and Brian Lane, who had been intimidated into silence. Elijah listened to their stories, validating their experiences and assuring them they would be protected from retaliation. "You spoke up for justice," he told them during a small meeting, "and I will do everything in my power to make sure your voices are heard." Beyond the department, Elijah turned his attention to the victims of police misconduct in the community. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents who had been affected by abusive practices to share their stories. The meeting was both heartbreaking and illuminating. A father recounted being mistreated while protecting his child. A woman described being denied assistance because of prejudice. Young people, like the teenage Elijah once was, shared feelings of voicelessness and powerlessness. Elijah didn't just listen, he acted. He reopened old cases that had been ignored or dismissed, committing to review each one fairly. He also proposed reforms to ensure that victims could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. "I can't promise everything will change overnight," Elijah said at the town hall, "but I promise to work tirelessly to make a difference." Elijah's efforts weren't met with unanimous support. Some veteran officers quietly opposed him, accusing him of dismantling traditions and harming the department's reputation. But Elijah remained undeterred. He understood that dismantling a deeply entrenched system of injustice required persistence, courage, and a willingness to stand against resistance. One evening, as Elijah left the station, he passed a group of children playing basketball on a nearby street. He paused for a moment, watching their carefree laughter and light-hearted shouts. The sight brought a small, bittersweet smile to his face. He saw in those children the hope that the future could be different, a hope that motivated him to keep pushing forward. This is for them, he thought as he turned to walk home. For every child who deserves to grow up in a fairer world. As Elijah Barnes walked home that evening, he passed a group of children playing basketball on a quiet street. He stopped for a moment, watching them laugh and shout with carefree joy. In his mind, he saw himself as a 16-year-old boy in a worn hoodie, carrying a heavy backpack of books, dreaming of a fairer world. I'm doing this for them, Elijah thought, a renewed sense of purpose strengthening his resolve. He wasn't just a chief of security. He was a leader with a mission to make justice not just an idea, but a reality. In the hopeful eyes of the community's youth, Elijah saw the long road ahead, but also the progress they were beginning to make. Elijah's reform efforts were creating ripples of change within the department, but for Frank Milton, it was the beginning of the end. The investigation into his actions had not only revealed his abuse of power at the airport, but also uncovered a history of violations that had gone unchecked for years. Day by day, the pillars of Frank's career, his authority, respect, and position, crumbled before his eyes. On a tense Monday morning, officers were summoned to the main assembly hall for an important departmental meeting. The agenda was unclear, but the air was heavy with anticipation. Frank entered the room, avoiding the eyes of his colleagues. He took a seat in the back row, attempting to project his usual air of indifference, though his clammy hands betrayed his unease. Elijah stepped up to the podium, standing tall as his gaze swept across the room. He allowed a moment of silence to settle, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but piercing. Over the past few weeks, we've conducted an extensive internal investigation. The findings not only highlight individual misconduct, but also underscore our collective responsibility to uphold ethical standards and maintain the trust of the community we serve. Elijah paused, opening a file on the desk in front of him. After thorough review, this department has decided that Officer Frank Milton will be stripped of his badge, effective immediately, and will face legal charges for severe misconduct and ethical violations. The room fell silent. Officers turned to look at Frank, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet relief. Others couldn't hide their disdain. Frank sat frozen, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Milton, Elijah continued, his tone firm but controlled, your actions have not only disgraced this department, but have also harmed the very people we swore to protect. Today you will face the consequences of your choices. Elijah nodded toward two officers, who stepped forward. Frank rose from his seat reluctantly, his face a mask of disbelief. One of the officers reached out and removed the badge from Frank's uniform, the symbol of authority he had wielded for over 2 decades. At that moment, Frank felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. Later that evening, Frank sat numbly on his couch at home, his hands trembling. The cluttered table before him was filled with legal documents, disciplinary notices, and evidence of the charges he now faced. For days, Frank had convinced himself that the storm would pass, that he could somehow survive it. But now, reality was undeniable. He had lost everything. When his wife, Marlene, entered the room, Frank looked at her with pleading eyes. Marlene, you don't understand. This is all a setup. Barnes and those younger officers, they're trying to ruin me. Marlene crossed her arms, her expression weary and filled with disappointment. Frank, do you really think I haven't seen what's going on? The whole community has seen it. You abused your power. You crossed the line, and I can't stand by and watch this anymore. Frank's voice cracked with desperation. What are you saying? We're a family. You can't leave me. Shaking her head, Marlene's voice trembled. This isn't the first time, Frank, but this time, it's gone too far. I can't teach Ava to forgive behavior like this, and I can't forgive you either. Just then, their daughter Ava walked in, overhearing her mother's words. She looked at Frank, the admiration she once had for him replaced by disillusionment. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but full of disappointment, "you always thought you were protecting justice. But you don't see that you've become the reason people don't trust the police anymore." Frank started to argue but stopped, realizing he had nothing to say, nothing to defend himself. Marlene and Ava began packing their belongings. As they prepared to leave, Marlene turned back one last time. Her eyes were filled with regret. "We were a family, Frank, but you destroyed that." The house felt eerily quiet after they left. Frank sat alone in the living room, staring blankly out the window. The respect he once commanded, the career he had built, and the family he had loved were all gone. For the first time, Frank began to acknowledge the weight of his actions. Perhaps, in the suffocating silence, there was a faint glimmer of an opportunity to face himself, to begin anew. But would he have the courage to confront his failures, or would he let himself be consumed by bitterness and regret? That, he realized, was a question only he could answer. The departure of Frank Milton marked a pivotal turning point for the police department under Elijah Barnes's leadership. For Elijah, the removal of one individual was not a cause for celebration. It was the first step in addressing the deeply rooted flaws within the system. He understood that dismantling corruption required more than holding one person accountable. It demanded a complete transformation of how the department operated. Elijah's goal wasn't just to regain the community's trust, but to rebuild a department that was truly fair, transparent, and worthy of respect. In the weeks following Frank's dismissal, Elijah began rolling out a comprehensive reform plan he had been developing for months. On the first morning after Frank's removal, he convened a meeting with the department's leadership team. Standing before them, Elijah made his intentions clear. "We cannot build trust with the community if we are not trustworthy ourselves," he began. "Starting today, we will not only correct the mistakes of the past, but also lay the foundation for a future that everyone in this department and this community can take pride in." He announced a series of sweeping changes, including a mandatory training program for all staff, from recruits to senior leaders. The program emphasized identifying and eliminating biases while promoting fairness and accountability in every aspect of their duties. Elijah didn't shy away from addressing uncomfortable truths. For too long, many of us, knowingly or unknowingly, have allowed prejudice to influence our actions, he said during one meeting. "We need to confront this reality, not to assign blame, but to drive meaningful change." To foster accountability, Elijah established an anonymous reporting system managed by an independent, external team. This system ensured that any reports of misconduct would be handled with transparency and without fear of retaliation. Elijah made a promise that no case would be ignored, no matter how difficult. Unsurprisingly, the changes were met with resistance from some veteran officers who felt threatened by the shift. "We've been doing things this way for decades," one officer grumbled during a meeting. "Why change now?" Elijah remained resolute. With calm determination, he responded, "Decades don't mean right. If we don't change now, we risk losing everything: trust, respect, and our ability to carry out our mission." At the same time, Elijah focused on building bridges with the community. He invited community leaders, human rights activists, and representatives from non-governmental organizations to participate in public forums. These forums weren't just spaces for discussion. They were opportunities to listen, understand, and develop actionable solutions. During one such forum, Linda Parker, a respected human rights advocate, addressed the crowd. "Our community has endured too much harm from abuses of power," she said. "But today, I stand here to say that if this police department is genuinely committed to change, we are willing to work with you to rebuild trust." Elijah listened attentively to every question, criticism, and suggestion. After each forum, he and his team documented the feedback and created actionable solutions, from increasing oversight of police activities to launching educational programs that help the community understand their rights. One of Elijah's most impactful initiatives was organizing regular meetings between officers and community members. In these gatherings, officers weren't there to give orders. They were there to listen. These candid conversations helped dispel misconceptions on both sides and laid the groundwork for mutual respect. The reforms didn't just transform the department's operations, they reinvigorated the morale of its officers. Younger officers like Bethany Ruiz and Brian Lane, once disillusioned by the department's toxic culture, now felt a renewed sense of purpose. They began to see their roles as more than just enforcing the law. They saw it as a mission to bring fairness and dignity to everyone they served. Still, Elijah knew the journey was far from over. Change wouldn't come overnight or even in a few months, but small signs of progress began to emerge. Each time Elijah stepped outside the department and saw community members smiling or greeting him with a nod of approval, he felt a flicker of hope. These were small but meaningful victories, proof that trust was beginning to return. For Elijah, these reforms weren't just professional obligations, they were deeply personal. They were the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself as a teenager. A promise to create a world where no one would have to endure the injustice he once faced. Under his leadership, the department's sweeping changes became a focal point for the community. While there was growing appreciation for Elijah's efforts, the echoes of Frank Milton's actions still lingered. The public, though encouraged by the reforms, hadn't forgotten the man who once epitomized abuse of power and injustice. For Frank, the community's collective indignation was a relentless and unforgiving sentence, one that extended far beyond the legal consequences he faced. As the department and the community moved forward, Elijah remained focused on the road ahead. He understood that change was not an endpoint, but a continuous journey, and with each step, he was determined to ensure that justice wasn't just a promise, but a reality for all. Frank Milton sat in the now empty house that had once been filled with his family's laughter and warmth. Marlene and Ava had left weeks earlier, taking with them the stories, love, and life that had defined the home. Now, all that remained was silence and cold, barren walls. Frank held a picture frame in his trembling hands. It was an old family photo from a picnic years ago. In the image, he smiled brightly with Marlene's arm around him, and Ava standing between them, her innocent grin radiating pure joy. That smile, Frank realized, now existed only in memories. He placed the photo on the table, his chest heavy with regret. Over the past few days, Frank had tried to justify his actions. He told himself that he had only done things the way they had always been done, that he wasn't the first to abuse power, and certainly wouldn't be the last. But the more he repeated these excuses, the hollower they felt. Turning on his old TV, Frank was immediately confronted with the image he had tried to escape. There he was, burning Elijah Barnes's passport at the airport. Protesters in the news clip held signs demanding justice, and the segment detailed the legal charges he now faced. Frank switched off the TV, but the images had already burned themselves into his mind. For the first time in years, Frank began to truly question himself. He couldn't deny the harm he had caused, not just to the man at the airport, but to the younger colleagues he had bullied, like Bethany Ruiz, and to the community he had sworn to protect yet ultimately betrayed. One morning, Frank did something he never thought he would. Dressing neatly, he left the house and walked toward the police department. As he passed through town, the gazes of the townspeople were cold, some openly contemptuous. Frank felt the weight of their judgment, and he didn't blame them. He knew he had become a symbol of everything they despised. Entering the police department felt like stepping into a world both familiar and foreign. The once familiar hallways now seemed distant, and the few colleagues who saw him avoided his eyes. Any respect they might have once held for him was long gone, and Frank knew it. Stopping in front of Elijah's office door, Frank took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," Elijah's calm voice called from inside. Frank stepped into the room. Elijah looked up, his expression briefly registering surprise before settling into his usual composed demeanor. He straightened in his chair, waiting for an explanation from the man standing before him. "Chief Barnes," Frank began, his voice lower and shakier than he had intended. I don't know where to start, but I'm here to apologize." Elijah didn't respond, simply gesturing for Frank to continue. "I was wrong," Frank admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. "Not just at the airport, but for years. I abused my power, neglected my responsibilities, and hurt so many people. I can't change what happened, but I want to make things right." Elijah studied Frank for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was firm but measured. Recognizing your mistakes is the first step, Milton. But to truly change, you need to act. Words alone won't repair the damage you've done. Frank nodded, his eyes red and teary. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want to do something, anything, to make amends. After a moment of thought, Elijah replied, Start by learning to listen. I can help you find ways to contribute positively to the community, but the rest is up to you. Leaving the department, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in months. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, and redemption wouldn't come easily. But for the first time, Frank felt as though he was moving in the right direction, not to reclaim his lost reputation, but to do what was right. Under Elijah's leadership, the police department didn't just move past the fallout from Frank's actions. It became a symbol of reform and renewal. Programs such as anti-bias training and anonymous reporting systems began yielding visible results. Younger officers like Bethany Ruiz and Brian Lane no longer hesitated to speak up, knowing they would be heard and supported. Even some veteran officers who had initially resisted the changes began to embrace them, recognizing the positive impact they had on the department's culture. Elijah didn't stop at internal reforms. He continued to focus on bridging the gap between the police and the community. One of his standout initiatives was the formation of collaborative groups where officers and residents worked together to solve neighborhood issues. These meetings fostered open dialogue, allowing citizens to voice their concerns and officers to better understand the community's needs. The relationship between the police and the community, once deeply fractured, began to heal. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the signs of progress were clear. Elijah knew that the journey was far from over, but each step forward brought them closer to a system that truly served justice and fairness. For Elijah, these reforms were more than a professional mission. They were personal. They were a promise he had made to himself as a teenager, standing in front of officers who had abused their power. Now, he was determined to ensure that no one else would endure what he had faced. As the department continued to rebuild, the echoes of Frank Milton's actions remained a reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. Frank's journey was far from over, and his path toward redemption would be long and uncertain. But for Elijah Barnes and the department, one thing was clear. Change had begun, and there was no turning back.